My name is Janice. I am the chair of the Cultural Anthropology program. I'm now going to introduce Ebony Janice. Ebony earned her BA in Cultural Anthropology here at Ashford University. After graduation, she went on to earn her MA, and she now works on issues of social justice, racial justice, gender issues, the intersectionality of all these different forms of identity and different forms of marginalization. She works through community organization, education, and one of her great accomplishments has been to initiate her project called Black Girl Mixtape. I thank Ebony so much for joining us today, and without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for having me. A special thank you to Dr. Catherine Sorensen for maintaining a relationship with me since my time in a class of hers many years ago, and just being such a dear friend now at this point, and supporter of my work. As I've been introduced, my name is Ebony Janice. I am going to be talking today about decolonizing your education, and I'm doing it from this hip-hop womanist perspective, and I'll give some definition, explanation, and understanding of that as we get further into the presentation. To a brief, understanding of who I am Ebony Janice. I did graduate from Ashford in 2015. And I received my Master's of Art in Social Change with a concentration in spiritual and religious leadership from a small school in the Graduate Theological Union in 2018 in Berkeley, California. I am a preacher, and I do my work, my ministry work and my mission work through an organization that I founded called the Free People Project. I am an educator, and I will tell you more about BGM Institute later in this conversation. I am the founder of Black Girl Mixtape, which is a multi-platform lecture series that I created to center the intellectual authority of Black women. And I am a coach and a hip-hop womanist, and we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of hip-hop womanism in this conversation around decolonization as well. Now, as I said, I got my BA from Ashford in cultural anthropology. So the majority of this conversation will be from a Black womanist anthropological perspective, right? Like I'm talking about anthropology, but I believe that this conversation around decolonizing education is for everybody that is in this conversation, is for everybody in general. So my first statement is that your education is colonized. And I've defined colonization here as the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. The action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use, the act of setting up a colony away from one's own place of origin. And so I'm suggesting that your education is colonized because the idea that people weren't already existing in a worthy or credible way before white men showed up, particularly in America, is a colonized and racist educational system then. This system that is set up makes the assumption that people didn't already exist. It also makes the assumption that people weren't already theorizing or contributing to any type of canon that was outside of the white male gaze. And it also makes the assumption that all source material must be filtered through the approval mechanism of white male authority, particularly in the US, this academic structure that we all reside in. Talking about colonized anthropology specifically and its legacy of racism, because I think discussing racism, and I'm just talking from this one perspective of race, and I haven't even gotten to the issues of gender. But the anthropologists tended to be a white middle-class man from US or Europe. I said tended as in past tense, but tends to be. The subjects tended and tend to be virtually all people that were studied were poor people of color from non-Western cultures historically. And the findings tended to be, and I would say still tend to be, inaccessible to the subjects and offer little or no contribution to improving the lives of those studied. So again, this colonized education makes these assumptions that people didn't already exist. They weren't living in a credible way. It makes the assumption that people weren't already having intellectual conversation or contributing to any type of canon that was outside of the white male gaze, and that all of their source material must be filtered through the approval mechanism of white male authority, which tends to be, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but peer-reviewed publishing. I've often stated that womanism in relation to feminism does not require the word intersectional, because womanism is inherently intersectional, because Black women in their work has historically always entered at the space of both their race and their gender. So as a result of Black women's intellectual and professional work historically also has a very interdisciplinary approach, because the canon Black women pull from for source material is not the same as the white male standard. That means that it's not solely anthropological, despite it being anthropological in nature, but they have also an eagerness to use tools of literature, sociology, history, Black studies, and women's studies to provide a more comprehensive set of supplemental materials. And when I talk a little bit about BGM Institute later in this conversation, I will give some more specific examples of what that looks like to be pulling from all of these different places and not just producing a canon that is specifically written, published, peer-reviewed material. So I wanted to talk about how is this relevant for all of you? How is this relevant even if your focus isn't necessarily on racial or gender equality, although it should be? And so I will mention and lift the idea of the politics of citation. So academia's racism has a role in shaping what is credible, what is the credible canon. And again, I've been saying that white male-centered systems have said that then we need to have usually published peer-reviewed materials. But if that is the only credible canon, then that means that there are already people who will not have access to their work being lifted or centered, because we do live in a cis-patriarchal white supremacist society. So we understand that just certain, and all the other isms, ableism, classism, these make it so that there are a certain group of people who always have their work and their knowledge production lifted above others, if others even have, the same access. Postmodern critiques have yet to shift resources or access in equal part to non-white male scholars. And then Black women scholars exist, and period, particularly from this anthropological perspective, but whose job is it to prove this? I am suggesting that it is academia's job to go out of its way to prove this. And I'll speak to that a little bit later when I talk about your role in decolonizing your own education. So why have I deemed this a conversation around decolonizing your education, but from this hip hop womanist perspective, but particularly hip hop? The socio-political within hip hop is important, because hip hop is the contemporary language of the dominant culture. Like, despite the fact that the history of hip hop comes from poor Black and brown neighborhoods predominantly, and that is predominantly where the culture is being created, hip hop is absolutely the culture now of the dominant culture across the world. So what is the ethics of excluding this language and its origin from a conversation about what is worthy or credible? There are spiritual religious elements to hip hop, which I go into depth from my hip hop womanist conversations. My womanism isn't just from a sociopolitical direction, it's also from a spiritual religious. So Black scholars, particularly Black women scholars, have been including spirituality and religious considerations and contributions in their work, in their research, in their studies from the beginning of time, from the beginning of their acknowledged and unacknowledged contributions to anthropological work. And we see that in the work of, one of the most well-known Black anthropologists, which is Zora Neale Hurston, Black women anthropologist, which is Zora Neale Hurston, who is always, no matter what work she was doing, always lifting spiritual, religious conversations in the context. Hip hop is a major vehicle for documenting the stories and the language. So just think about ethnography. It would be impossible to have a conversation without using the language of the dominant culture, without being able to use the vehicle of hip hop to, document those stories and to talk about that language. And then the lived experience. Who is more credible than those living the experience to create source material, to engage the research and the researcher, to prove or disprove the theory? And so that is why I am suggesting that hip hop is an important part of this conversation for myself, because I'm also doing work from a spiritual religious perspective, like having scholarly conversations about what does it look like to cite 2 Chainz, to cite Jay-Z in the same way that I might cite Paul, or that I might cite Peter. And I have done extensive amount of work around this. So I do have some proof, and I'll share a little bit of that later. I do have some proof that you can have access to, that there is sacred text. This should be considered sacred text. And we should be having scholarly conversation about hip hop lyrics as well. So I am suggesting that the way that I am decolonizing my own education and my own experience is through this hip hop womanist anthropological intervention, which intends to interrupt or disrupt the elitist, sexist, and racist dynamics that have plagued anthropology historically and that continue to inform its training, research funding, scholarly recognition, professional networks, and publications. In a phrase, all anthropological knowledge production and reproduction. If you cannot get research funding or published in a cishet patriarchal educational system which insists that the canon is centering written text, usually peer-reviewed by an unbalanced group of people with bias towards white maleness as the standard, then can you ever be considered credible? That's a question that I believe we all should be asking. Faye B. Harrison, who has made substantial contributions both to the field of sociology and anthropology, also says, furthermore, the politics of canon formation results in the peripheralization and erasure of much of the scholarship which people of color and women produce. So this is just putting an emphasis on the fact that it's not that people of color, it's not that Black women, it's not that women are not producing or not contributing. There is no way, based on the politics of the canon formation, there is no way at this point, without our intentional contribution to decolonizing our education, there is no way for those people to be lifted and to be centered. So again, decolonizing our education is important for all of us, and should be important to all of us, because what we don't realize when we create what it is that we're creating, I lost the slide somewhere, but I will just speak to what I was going to say. What we don't realize is that it's not just people in, the greatest margins. It's not just Black women that are harmed or as a result of a colonized education, as a result of biased education, as a result of racist and sexist education. It is all of us. Even the white male whose work is more likely historically to be centered or to be or having access or having resources. Even the white male is at a loss as a result of a colonized education, because when you only know what the standard or the norm is for, what the administration has submitted for curriculum or what the instructor has put in the syllabus, if we're just having the same conversations over and over again, then we have this stock information, whereas people of color and other people in marginalized communities have had to go above and beyond to intentionally decolonize their educational experience. And that is how you end up with, in primary school, for example, you end up with a school system during Black History Month that talks about the same 5 or 6 leaders, Black leaders, the same 5 or 6 inventors, the same 5 or 6 people who academia has considered credible and noteworthy. And then you have Black families and or Black Indigenous people of color having to go out of their way to educate themselves beyond that. And so there is all of this brilliance that's being excluded from the conversation, that also people in, that are considered, worthy, are also missing out on that information. And so in the slide that's missing, I was suggesting that what our responsibility is, what the Academy's responsibility is, what the administration's responsibility is, and what the instructor's responsibility is to decolonizing our education is simply starting with the politics of citation, meaning decolonize that syllabus. Start being more intentional. When I was at Ashford, unfortunately, the only time that we had any conversations in the majority of my anthropology courses, that we had any conversation specifically about Blackness, was there. It wasn't primarily centering Black anthropologists, and they exist. There are many. It's not like it's some obscure or very tiny group of people. There are many Black women doing important and what has been deemed credible work in this field, but there has not yet, unless that has happened since I left, there has not been an overly intentional effort put into making sure that there were Black women and Black men and other people of color especially centered in the conversation, not from just this perspective of being studied, right? Like primarily the subject, but very rarely historically being the ones who have been lifted as credible. And for the student, it is your responsibility to decolonizing your education is to go out of your way to, again, participate in the politics of citation. Citations are political because the more you cite, the more you quote, the more you lift the voices of people that have been in the margins. And I'm emphasizing Black women, and I'm emphasizing Blackness and people of color. But even for women, it is our responsibility to our gender and to, our contribution to make sure that we're lifting the voices and the contribution, the intellectual contribution, because when we do that, again, it is political. If I cite you once and then someone has to cite me, they also then have to cite you. So now we have this continual lifting of your voice and your work and honoring that as credible. My work is through Black Girl Mixtape and through BGM Institute. My goal is to decolonize everything. Is to go into every single field, have conversations that something likely existed before the group of people that created the standard showed up. And so what do we do then when we have conversations and do our research and lift the voices of those who have not been centered within those industries or within those fields? We are then giving ourselves permission to learn, usually from the source, the people whose actual experience it was, and or to learn from other voices who have something credible and necessary and worthy to lift as well. So with Black Girl Mixtape is a multi-platform lecture series that I created to center and celebrate the intellectual authority of Black women. And it is several things. It's a podcast, a lecture series. It's an ongoing docu-series. There is a fellowship, and there is a one-on-one coaching aspect to it. And the lecture series portion of it literally is exactly what it sounds like. I'm going from city to city. In 2018, I did an 8-city tour with Black Girl Mixtape, where I was offering this stage And imagine a TED Talk, but specifically centering the intellectual contributions of Black women, offering this stage to Black women all over the U.S. To come and talk about their work. So we're talking, you know, from education, academia, to mental health, to there are definitely some anthropology conversations happening, and it just was such a brilliant space for Black women to be called on as the authority. And a thing that you may not note, and I can't see everybody right now, so I don't know what the actual demographic is or the makeup of the people in this group right now, but for Black women, this conversation around decolonizing is so important, and a conversation about authority and decolonizing authority is so important because there are Black women that are even doing work for 30 plus years that have PhDs, which would be considered credible. And I know that there are also women that may not be Black that can relate with this, but have PhDs, and that every single time I ask them, they were blown away that I was asking them to come and be on this platform as the authority, not just to talk about the work or the field, but to be on this platform as the authority. So even the standards or the that have been in place for what we would consider, oh, you are an authority, even having the education, the experience, the years of experience, none of that has taken away from what it means to be Black and woman, specifically in this context, Black and woman in those roles, still having to be, you know, question whether or not you are the authority. And to further emphasize what I mean by that, I mean, there are women like Angela Davis, Alice Walker, Dr. Monica Coleman, who were blown away by being asked to come and talk as the authority. and the women that I just mentioned, if they are not the authority in their fields, then whoever will be. So that is just to show you that the space of being both Black and woman definitely impacts the way that we are received, and even the ways that we are dealing with imposter syndrome for ourselves, despite how much our education and lived experience is. And then finally, BGM Institute is an online learning institution that I founded in 2018. And the intention of BGM Institute is specifically the idea of decolonizing education. So the school, it's an online school. There are currently 6 courses, and each course is taught by a Black woman. It's open to all people, but all of our classes are taught by Black women who have academic backgrounds of some sort. I'm teaching 2 classes, an introduction to the African spirit religions and Beyonce's Lemonade, it's Beyonce's Spirit Justice course. And I'm also teaching a class that I created called Hip Hop as Liberation Theology. And then there is a class on decolonizing mental health. It's being called the Underground Railroad. There is a queer theologian that is teaching a class on decolonizing Christianity. And then there is a body positive theologian teaching a class on healing faith and sexual trauma. And so BGM Institute is growing. We're adding more courses and having more conversation. And the ways that this is decolonizing education is we're giving access, right? Like, we recognize that our education is a privilege. So we're giving access to all this information that normally you'd have to pay for your JSTOR. You know, if you're not currently in school, you'd have to pay for, you know, access to some of these journals. And so the way that our classes are set up is it makes sure that people have, we're creating a canon of our own to make sure that people have access to all kinds of source materials, and not just exclusively having to log into some website that they might have to pay for, or that they might have to be enrolled at an institution to have access to. So we're making not just education financially accessible, but also creating a language that is accessible as well. And that is a thing that anthropology in many ways in the past has not done. It's done these studies, done this research, had these conversations in these particular communities, and then written about those people in a way that they wouldn't even be able to have access to, not because they lack some type of intellectual sameness or equity, but because we all know that like the way that we write in academia is just, I feel like y'all can see me and you know what I'm saying. So, and then again, my hip hop womanist work is me intentionally doing decolonization work around religion and spirituality, most specifically. And I'm doing that through teaching on a podcast that I have created called Rap Theology. And then I was mentioning earlier that I have been having intentional conversations and creating and doing research and creating content and commentary that proves that hip hop is also, the language of hip hop is also sacred text. If we have identified the Bible as sacred text or the Quran as sacred text, then I have literally lined up lyrics with much of what is happening in the text that we have considered sacred text. And I've proven that the lyrics also are speaking to these same ideas. So if one is credible, then these must be considered credible as well. And I do that through this hashtag that I created on social media. It's called PreachEb. And my PreachEb videos are usually giving me that opportunity to speak to that. Finally, and I have run out of time, finally, if you would love to learn more about who I am and the work that I do, and in the work of BGM Institute or Black Girl Mixtape and or my ministry, here are all the ways to be in touch with me. And what I will do is I will add the slides that went missing in action, and I'll share this with the organizers so that you can have access to this information as well and have my contact information. So thank you so much for your time. I wish that there was more time because I certainly would have dealt with each space for a little bit longer, but I was like trying to run through.
Thank you so much, Ebony. This was so great. I mean, it was so interesting. And I think you really get to the core of the problems of anthropology and education in general. And part of what happens is, as you say, the citations, because it goes into textbooks, it goes into anthology. So when you create a class, it's actually difficult to go beyond. Again, we try, but it's not always available. So the work that you're doing to getting those voices available so that they can be incorporated, I mean, that's exactly the work we need for future students, to simply have an education that just cover more, that is less focused on one angle.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your being available for this conversation. And I look forward to continuing to be in relationship with Ashford for many more years. Who would have thought?